Here we have the scene in the Gospels of Jesus walking on water. It's reported in 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, John. There are the references. What's really interesting is that every Gospel writer gives a different story. And of course, you know, I suppose you would expect that, but it's also really interesting that most modern Protestant Christians, anyway, we're not very good at looking at the contradictions in the text. What tends to happen is believers just combine all the differences into a meta-narrative, and they create a meta-gospel, right? Matthew remembers this, Mark remembers this, John remembers this, therefore the truth must be all of it. And so we'll just homogenize it all and create this narrative where Jesus does all these things. I don't think that's very smart methodology. I think it's much more enlightening to look at the contradictions as contradictions. And to see what we can learn, what the differences are. In the story of Matthew, Jesus departs to pray. The disciples are in the boat. A storm comes. They call to Jesus. He walks on water. Peter briefly walks on the water. In the Gospel of Mark, something else happens. It's a little bit humorous. Jesus tries to walk by the floundering disciples. What's that about? They're about to die in a storm, and they see Jesus, and he's sneaking on by, and they call to him and say, "Hey, save us!" And Jesus looks over and said, "Oh, okay, I'll save you." And then in the book of John, something else happens. He walks on water. He saves the disciples, but he saves the disciples by transporting their boat instantly to the other side of the shore. No, wait a second. What? That's a miracle greater than walking on water. He just zipped out a TARDIS out of nowhere and moved the boat instantaneously across the sea.
Thank you, Doctor Who.
Yeah, that's right. And so we get these radical differences in the Gospels. All right, so the first thing I did as a scholar is I went to the library to look up what the biblical scholars have said about the Jesus walking on water narrative. And so there's this great book by Patrick Madden where he goes through all the modern scholarship, or the scholarship of the 20th century anyway, and he divides how biblical scholars have interpreted this narrative motif, Jesus walking on water, into 5 different categories. And I thought I would show these guys because one of the big criticisms that mainstream biblical scholars have against astrotheology is that it's just too subjective. Now look at what mainstream Bible scholars do with the interpretation of any story in the Bible. It's like throwing a dart at a dartboard, except the dartboard is any damn well thing you want to believe. I mean, it's historical, it's not historical. Maybe it's historical, it happened, it's miraculous, it's not miraculous. It's you know, look, Bible scholarship runs the whole gamut, right? And so it's as subjective as anything else, you know, and that's just good to know. Here's another aspect of scholarly methodology that we should be aware of. It cannot address the divine. It cannot address the supernatural. It can't. There's nothing in scholarly methodology that can prove or disprove anybody walking on water. It's just outside.
Right.
It's just outside of its purview. You know, so is Jesus historical, and did he really overcome death? You know what? There's no scholarly methodology that can tell you. That is a choice you have to make, and it's a choice of faith. It's a leap of faith. That's all you get. And so there's nothing that you're going to find in the archaeological record that's going to prove it or disprove it. You know, the mythicists say there's no evidence for a historical Jesus. Well, whatever evidence there is, we've got it. Right? What kind of evidence are you going to find that would prove to you that Jesus is historical? Let's say you found a birth record and it said, on this date, 6 BC, 6 AD, whatever, Jesus was born to Joseph and Mary from Nazareth, and a donkey and a sheep were by his stable. let's say you found that birth record. What would scholars do? They would immediately say it's a fraud, right? I mean, we take evidence and we process it through our own, our own cultural lenses and our own prejudices. If you ever sit in a courtroom, you can see two lawyers arguing over the same evidence from completely different points of view, and you quickly learn, oh my gosh, any evidence can be argued in almost any way. And the other thing is, I've been around scholars long enough to know that if you were to transport 100 modern day scholars back in time and in a TARDIS, and you transported them right in front of Jesus, right at the moment that he's raising Lazarus from the dead, so that they could see this happen for themselves, a few scholars would probably fall on their knees and say, I believe. And I'm not even going back to my own time in the TARDIS. I'm going to stay here and become a disciple of Jesus. A few people would do that. A few others would go, yeah, I do believe, but I'm going to start my own school and charge tuition because you got to make money somehow, right? And so they start their own religion, right? A few scholars would do that. But I'm telling you, the majority of scholars, this is what they would do. They'd pick up a club and they'd beat poor Lazarus back to death. They'd throw his corpse back into the tomb and they'd turn to Jesus and they'd say, that never happened. We're in our own conceptual universes, and so we go to this material with our own conceptual interpretations of what we accept as evidence and not evidence. And look here in front of your screen, all the different scholarly interpretations of the Jesus walking on water motif, and it's everything you can conceive. And so,
John,
yes.
you brought back memories of grad school.
Well,
you know when you're.
I'm just describing grad school.
Yeah, that's all you're doing. When you finally decide after months of looking at the literature what your PhD thesis, what your dissertation is going to be about, and then you find out that some scholar has already done that study.
Yeah.
And then you hide it in a corner of the library, hoping that nobody will discover it. Okay. I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Edit that out, Derek. Edit that out.
That's right.
Right.
Hey, Derek, there's a lot you got to edit out of tonight's show. Thank goodness. You can edit. I'll let you edit anything you want. Put in a picture of a cat somewhere. What really piqued my interest in reading this scholar's review of all the scholarly interpretations is this last one. Madden actually belongs to this camp. He believes that the story of Jesus walking on water is a displaced resurrection narrative. And he gives reasons why, he believes this, and here are essentially his reasons. If you look at all the stories in the Gospels about Jesus walking on water, and you compare that to when Jesus first appears to the disciples, this isn't to Mary or the women at the tomb, but to the disciples, strangely enough, Jesus appears to the disciples by the sea. In John 21:1, the exact Greek phrase can be interpreted as by the sea or on the sea. And that exact same phrase is used in all the sea walk narratives in all three Gospels. But also the similarities are these. The disciples are bereft of the Lord, darkness followed by the appearance of the Lord. The appearance of the Lord occurs at or right before dawn, a formal greeting, including command not to fear the Lord, difficulty recognizing the Lord. In other words, there's these common motifs between the sea walk narrative and Jesus first appearing to the disciples. So Madden and a group of scholars say what we think happened is you had this resurrection narrative, but it got split up. And so now you get this one scene of Jesus walking on the sea, saving the disciples, but originally it was Jesus walking on the sea, saving the disciples over death.